In the vast, unforgiving wilderness of Montana's Flathead National Forest, an aging bobcat named Shadow, once a dominant force, finds himself trapped on a narrow cliff ledge, injured and facing certain death. When wildlife rehabilitator Jake Thornton heard a mysterious cry echoing through the canyon, he discovered the stranded predator. Jake knows the risks are immense. Rescuing a cornered, injured bobcat is a task most would deem reckless. Yet, compelled by a sense of duty, Jake faced an impossible choice. He embarks on a perilous descent. What follows on that treacherous ledge defies expectation. And then, just as safety seems within reach, disaster strikes on a remote bridge, throwing everything into chaos. What happened that day defined trust, survival, and the extraordinary connection that can form between species when destiny intervenes in the most unexpected ways. Before we start, hit the like button and make sure to subscribe if you haven't, and hit that notification bell so that you won't miss any new stories. The morning light filtered through the dense pine forest, casting long shadows across the rugged terrain of Montana's Flathead National Forest. Somewhere in this vast wilderness, an aging bobcat named Shadow by the local wildlife researchers who had once tracked him, moved silently through the underbrush. His once glossy coat had dulled with age, patches of gray appearing around his face and ears. His muscles, though leaner now, still carried the memory of countless hunts and narrow escapes that had defined his 12 years in these mountains. Shadow had once ruled these forests with unchallenged dominance. Larger than most male bobcats at 35 pounds in his prime, he had carved out a territory spanning nearly 15 square miles. Local researchers had fitted him with a tracking collar years ago, but he'd managed to shed it 3 seasons past, disappearing into the wilderness like a ghost. The wildlife biologists assumed he had died, as most bobcats rarely lived beyond 10 years in the wild. But Shadow had persisted, adapting to his aging body by hunting smaller prey and avoiding confrontations with younger males encroaching on his territory. This particular morning, hunger drove him from his den earlier than usual. He hadn't eaten in nearly 3 days, and the persistent growl in his stomach had become impossible to ignore. His once keen senses detected the subtle movement of a snowshoe hare approximately 50 yards ahead. The rabbit, plump from summer feeding, represented the best meal Shadow had encountered in weeks. The bobcat lowered his body to the ground, each paw placement deliberate and silent. His golden eyes, still sharp despite his advancing years, never left his target. The hare, sensing danger, froze momentarily before bolting across a rocky ridge that bordered a steep cliff dropping nearly 80 feet to a narrow ledge above the rushing waters of Fallen Creek. Shadow's predatory instincts took over. He launched into pursuit, his body remembering the power it once possessed. The chase led them along the precipitous edge of the cliff. In his younger days, such treacherous terrain would have posed no challenge. But age had compromised his balance and judgment. As he lunged for the hare, his back paw slipped on loose shale. The world suddenly tilted. Shadow felt his body tumbling through open air, his usual grace abandoned as he clawed desperately at the cliff face. Pain exploded through his right flank as he struck an outcropping before landing hard on a narrow ledge about 30 feet below the ridge. The impact knocked the breath from his lungs, leaving him stunned and disoriented. When Shadow regained his senses, he found himself trapped on a ledge barely 3 feet wide. Above him rose the sheer cliff face. Below him, another 50-foot drop to the creek's rocky shore. He tried to stand but collapsed as pain shot through his right hind leg. Not broken, but badly sprained. Blood matted the fur on his right side where the rocks had torn his skin. For hours, Shadow paced the small ledge, searching for an escape route. He attempted to climb several times, but each effort ended in failure as his injured leg gave out or his claws couldn't find purchase on the smooth rock face. As the day wore on, the cold mountain wind cut through his fur, chilling him to the bone. His cries of frustration echoed through the canyon, growing weaker as his strength faded. By late afternoon, Shadow had retreated to the innermost part of the ledge, curling into himself for warmth. His golden eyes, once fierce with determination, now reflected resignation. The great predator had finally encountered an obstacle he couldn't overcome. Jake Thornton drove his weather-beaten Ford F-150 along the winding Forest Service road, the vehicle's suspension groaning in protest at each pothole. At 45, Jake's weathered face told the story of a man who had spent most of his life outdoors. Deep lines etched the corners of his blue eyes, permanently squinted from years of facing the Montana sun. His brown hair, now liberally streaked with gray, was kept short under a faded Montana Wildlife Center cap. 20 years as a wildlife rehabilitator had taught Jake patience, respect for wild animals, and an understanding of their ways that few people possessed. After a stint as a ranger with the National Park Service in his 20s, he had found his calling in wildlife rescue and rehabilitation. Now he split his time between the Montana Wildlife Center, where he worked with injured animals, and his field work, monitoring wildlife in the Flathead region. Today's rounds were routine, checking trail cameras, looking for signs of injured animals, and observing the general health of the forest ecosystem. Spring had arrived late this year, and many animals were still struggling after a particularly harsh winter. Jake had already found 2 malnourished elk calves that morning and arranged for their transport to the center for rehabilitation. As he drove along the ridge overlooking Fallen Creek Canyon, something made him stop. Jake couldn't explain it. Call it intuition or the result of years spent attuned to the forest's rhythms. But something felt off. He pulled over, grabbed his binoculars from the passenger seat, and stepped out of the truck. The wind carried a sound, faint, almost imperceptible, but distinct from the normal forest chorus. Jake stood motionless, listening intently. There it was again. Not quite a growl, not quite a cry, but a sound of distress that raised the hair on the back of his neck. Jake returned to his truck and retrieved his backpack containing his rescue gear, a first aid kit for wildlife, and emergency supplies. He clipped a handheld radio to his belt and began following the sound on foot, making his way carefully along the ridge. The terrain grew increasingly treacherous as he approached the edge of the canyon. "Hello?" he called out, thinking perhaps a hiker might be in trouble. Only the wind answered. Jake crept closer to the edge and peered over, scanning the cliff face with his binoculars. At first, he saw nothing unusual, just the typical rock formations and sparse vegetation clinging to the canyon walls. Then a flash of movement caught his eye. Focusing his binoculars, Jake's breath caught in his throat. Approximately 30 feet below, a bobcat was pacing anxiously on a narrow ledge. Even from this distance, Jake could see the animal was injured. Blood stained its right flank, and it moved with a pronounced limp. The bobcat was larger than most he'd encountered, though it appeared somewhat emaciated. As he watched, the animal attempted to climb up the cliff face again, only to slide back down to the ledge, letting out another cry of frustration. Jake estimated the bobcat had been trapped for at least several hours, possibly since morning. The declining afternoon temperature would soon become dangerous for an injured animal, especially one weakened from what appeared to be inadequate nutrition. For most people, The smart decision would be to call the Forest Service or the Wildlife Center and let them handle the situation. Even among wildlife professionals, attempting to rescue a cornered predator, especially a bobcat, would be considered reckless. Bobcats were known for their ferocity when threatened, and their sharp claws and teeth could inflict serious damage. But Jake wasn't most people. He had successfully rescued injured predators before, including a young mountain lion 3 years earlier. Moreover, something about this particular bobcat's predicament moved him. The animal wasn't just trapped. It was exhausted, injured, and clearly at the end of its strength. Without intervention, it would not survive the night. Jake knew the risks. He also knew he couldn't walk away. He returned to his truck and gathered additional equipment: climbing gear, a specialized transport carrier for predators, heavy-duty gloves, and a tranquilizer gun. He hesitated over the tranquilizer. Sedating an already weakened animal could be risky, especially without knowing the extent of its injuries or how long it had gone without food. Jake decided to bring it as a last resort, but would attempt the rescue without chemical restraint if possible. After radioing his position and intentions to the Wildlife Center, Jake prepared for the climb down. He secured a rope to a sturdy pine tree well back from the edge and tested it with his full weight. Satisfied, he began his descent, controlling his speed with practiced ease. As he neared the ledge, the bobcat became aware of his presence. The animal retreated to the farthest edge of the outcropping, its golden eyes fixed on Jake with a mixture of fear and defiance. A low growl emanated from its throat, a warning Jake understood perfectly. "Easy there, old-timer," Jake said softly, keeping his voice calm and even. "I'm not here to hurt you." He had always spoken to animals during rescues. Jake didn't believe they understood the words, but they seemed to respond to the gentle cadence and non-threatening tone. He continued his descent, moving slowly to avoid startling the injured predator. When his boots touched the ledge, Jake remained still, giving the bobcat time to acclimate to his presence. The ledge was even narrower than it had appeared from above, barely 3 feet at its widest point and tapering to under 2 feet where the bobcat now crouched. One wrong move from either of them could send them plummeting to the creek below. "You're in quite a spot, aren't you?" Jake murmured, carefully removing his backpack and retrieving a pair of thick leather gloves. "Let's see if we can get you out of here." The bobcat growled again, but Jake noted it lacked the intensity typical of a healthy animal. Its sides heaved with each breath, and blood continued to seep from the wound on its flank. Up close, Jake could see this was an older male, well past his prime but still impressive. The animal's right hind leg appeared injured, though not broken from what Jake could observe. Normally, Jake would use a capture pole, a long rod with a looped cable at the end, to secure predators from a safe distance. But the confined space made that impossible. He would need to physically handle the bobcat to get it into the carrier, an extremely dangerous proposition under any circumstances. Jake spent nearly 20 minutes simply sitting on the ledge, occasionally speaking in soft tones but making no move toward the animal. Gradually, the bobcat's growls subsided, though its eyes never left Jake. The wildlife rehabilitator recognized the look, not just fear, but exhaustion. The fight was draining out of the proud predator minute by minute. As the sun began to dip toward the horizon, Jake knew it was time to act. The temperature would drop rapidly after sunset, and neither he nor the bobcat could safely remain on the ledge overnight. He slowly removed the transport carrier from his pack and placed it between himself and the animal, opening the door. "I know you're not going to like this," Jake said, inching forward. "But it's your only way out of here." The bobcat tensed as Jake moved closer, but it didn't retreat further. There was nowhere left to go. Jake had prepared himself for a fight, for claws and teeth and the adrenaline surge of danger. What he wasn't prepared for was what happened next. As he reached within 3 feet of the animal, close enough to touch it, the bobcat's posture changed. The tension in its body seemed to ease slightly, and though wariness remained in those golden eyes, the murderous intent Jake had expected wasn't there. Instead, he saw something that shocked him to his core. Recognition. Not of Jake personally, but a recognition of intent. Somehow, this wild predator understood that Jake represented its only chance at survival. Moving with deliberate slowness, Jake reached out toward the injured animal, speaking continuously in a low, soothing voice. The bobcat's ears flattened against its head, but it didn't strike. Taking a deep breath, Jake gently grasped the bobcat's forelegs. He expected resistance, scratching, biting, the unleashing of primal fury. Instead, the bobcat remained still, its body trembling slightly under Jake's hands. With a careful but firm grip, Jake began to lift the animal, cradling its hindquarters to avoid putting pressure on the injured leg. The bobcat weighed less than Jake had anticipated, another sign of its poor condition. As he raised it off the ledge, he felt the rapid beat of its heart against his forearm, the warmth of its breath on his wrist. One twist of that powerful neck, one swipe of those claws, and Jake's arms would be shredded. But the attack never came. With painstaking care, Jake maneuvered the bobcat into the transport carrier and secured the door. Only then did he allow himself to exhale the breath he'd been holding. The animal made no sound from within the carrier, a silence more unnerving than any growl. Now came the challenging part, getting both himself and the carrier back up the cliff face. Jake secured the carrier to his climbing harness, ensuring it would remain stable during the ascent. The added weight made the climb more difficult, but Jake's arms, strengthened by years of outdoor work, didn't falter. By the time they reached the top, twilight had descended on the forest. Jake was drenched in sweat despite the cool evening air, his muscles burning from the exertion. He carefully placed the carrier on level ground before collapsing beside it, chest heaving as he gulped in the fresh mountain air. Through the ventilation holes in the carrier, Jake could see the bobcat lying still, its golden eyes half closed with exhaustion. Both man and animal had reached the limits of their endurance. "We made it, old-timer," Jake said between breaths. "We actually made it." As his breathing steadied, Jake considered his next steps. The Montana Wildlife Center was over an hour's drive away. The bobcat needed professional care for its injuries, but moving it immediately might cause additional stress. Jake decided to rest briefly before beginning the journey back to his truck. As he sat beside the carrier, Jake found himself wondering about this particular bobcat. Its behavior defied everything he knew about wild predators. In his 2 decades of wildlife rescue, he had never encountered a bobcat that submitted so completely to human handling without sedation. Perhaps its injuries and exhaustion had simply sapped its will to fight. Or perhaps... Jake's thoughts were interrupted by a sound from within the carrier. Not a growl, but a soft chuffing noise. He leaned closer, peering through the ventilation holes. The bobcat had shifted position and was now looking directly at him. In the fading light, those golden eyes seemed to hold a question. "Don't worry," Jake said softly. "I'm going to get you some help." He rose to his feet and carefully lifted the carrier. The walk back to his truck was slow, each step measured to avoid jostling his injured passenger. Jake's mind raced with possibilities for the bobcat's care. Its age and condition would complicate treatment, but Jake had seen animals recover from worse. If rehabilitation was successful, release back into the wild might be possible, though the animal's age presented challenges for survival. When they finally reached the truck, Jake secured the carrier in the passenger seat rather than the bed, wanting to keep an eye on the bobcat during the drive. He radioed ahead to the wildlife center, informing them of his imminent arrival with an injured adult male bobcat. As Jake drove through the darkening forest, he occasionally glanced at the carrier beside him. The bobcat remained quiet, its breathing rapid but steady. Something about this animal had touched Jake deeply. Perhaps it was the dignity with which it had faced its predicament, or the trust, if that wasn't too human a concept to apply, it had shown during the rescue. Whatever the reason, Jake felt a connection to this particular creature that transcended his usual professional compassion. The road followed the creek for several miles before reaching a small bridge that crossed to the eastern bank. Jake slowed as he approached the bridge, noting how the creek had swollen with spring runoff. The normally placid water churned white as it rushed over the rocky creek bed. Halfway across the bridge, a loud bang startled Jake as his right front tire blew out. The truck swerved sharply, and Jake fought to maintain control on the narrow bridge. The steering wheel bucked in his hands as the vehicle slid sideways, crashing against the guardrail with enough force to deploy the airbags. Dazed but conscious, Jake felt warm blood trickling from a cut on his forehead where it had struck the steering wheel. The airbag had partially deflated, and through the haze of pain, Jake's first thought was for his passenger. The carrier had been thrown to the floor during the impact, its door springing open. The bobcat was nowhere to be seen. "No," Jake groaned, fumbling with his seatbelt. "No, no, no." He pushed open the driver's door and staggered out onto the bridge. The night air cleared his head somewhat, though dizziness threatened to topple him with each step. Jake scanned the bridge frantically, calling out as though the wild animal might respond to his voice. A movement at the far end of the bridge caught his attention. The bobcat, limping heavily, was making its way toward the tree line on the eastern bank. Despite its injuries, the animal moved with surprising speed, freedom overriding pain. "Wait!" Jake called out reflexively, then laughed at his own foolishness. What did he expect? That a wild bobcat would heed his call? He watched helplessly as the animal disappeared into the underbrush. All that effort, all that risk, for nothing. The bobcat would likely die of its injuries without treatment, or fall prey to larger predators in its weakened state. Jake felt a crushing sense of failure wash over him. Leaning against the damaged guardrail, Jake tried to focus. He needed to report the accident and get his head wound treated. The Wildlife Center staff would be waiting for him. With a heavy sigh, Jake reached for his radio, only to find it damaged beyond use in the crash. "Perfect," he muttered, turning back toward his truck to retrieve his cell phone. That's when he saw it. The bobcat had emerged from the underbrush and was standing at the edge of the bridge, its golden eyes reflecting the truck's headlights. For a long moment, predator and rescuer regarded each other across the distance. Then, inexplicably, the bobcat began moving toward Jake. Jake remained perfectly still, afraid any movement might spook the animal. The bobcat approached slowly, its limp more pronounced now, until it stood just 5 feet away. At this distance, Jake could see the animal was in even worse condition than he'd initially thought. Its breathing was labored, and fresh blood had seeped through the matted fur on its flank. "You should have kept going, old-timer," Jake said softly. "Your freedom was right there." The bobcat took another step forward, then another, until it stood directly before Jake. What happened next would remain etched in Jake's memory for the rest of his life. The bobcat lowered its head and gently, almost imperceptibly, pressed its forehead against Jake's leg. The gesture lasted only a second before the animal stepped back, but its meaning was unmistakable. "I'll be damned," Jake whispered, tears welling in his eyes. Whether it was gratitude, trust, or simply the instinctive seeking of help from the only source available, the bobcat had made a choice that defied wild nature. It had returned to the human who had saved it once already. Moving with deliberate slowness, Jake knelt and extended his hand, palm down, non-threatening. The bobcat tensed but didn't retreat. When Jake's fingers made contact with the animal's head, it flinched slightly but allowed the touch. "Let's try this again," Jake said, his voice thick with emotion. "Let's get you some help." Using his jacket as an improvised carrier, Jake carefully lifted the bobcat, which offered no resistance. He placed the animal on the passenger seat of his damaged truck and climbed in beside it. The vehicle was still operational despite the flat tire and body damage. Jake drove slowly, hyper-aware of his unusual passenger sitting freely beside him. When Jake finally arrived at the Montana Wildlife Center shortly after 9 p.m., his appearance caused an immediate stir. Blood had dried on his face from the head wound, and he emerged from the truck cradling a fully conscious bobcat in his arms like an oversized house cat. "Jake, what the hell?" Dr. Sarah Blackwood, the center's head veterinarian and Jake's colleague of 15 years, rushed forward before stopping short at the sight of the unrestrained predator. Are you carrying a bobcat without restraints?" "It's a long story, Sarah," Jake replied, the exhaustion evident in his voice. "But this old guy needs help, and so do I, as it happens." The next hours passed in a blur of activity. The bobcat was sedated and examined thoroughly. Dr. Blackwood confirmed Jake's initial assessment: severe dehydration, malnourishment, a deep laceration on the right flank requiring numerous stitches, and a badly sprained right hind leg. X-rays revealed arthritis in several joints and evidence of old injuries long healed. Blood tests showed the bobcat was approximately 12 years old, ancient by wild bobcat standards. While a nurse cleaned and bandaged Jake's head wound, Dr. Blackwood shared her findings. "He's in rough shape, Jake. Even without the new injuries, his body is just wearing out. Arthritis, dental issues, diminished kidney function, all consistent with extreme old age for his species. The fact he's survived this long in the wild is nothing short of miraculous." "Can you help him?" Jake asked. Sarah hesitated. "We can treat the immediate injuries, get him hydrated and fed. But Jake, you know as well as I do that releasing a bobcat this old back into the wild would be a death sentence. He's simply not capable of hunting effectively anymore." Jake nodded slowly. "And keeping him here long-term isn't an option. We're not set up for permanent care of predators, especially not one with his medical needs," Sarah confirmed. What remained unspoken was the likely outcome: humane euthanasia once the bobcat was stabilized and comfortable. It was often the kindest option for elderly wild animals unable to survive on their own. "Let me think about it," Jake said. "He's earned that much." 3 weeks later, Jake stood on the back porch of his cabin, watching the sunrise paint the distant mountains gold. Coffee steam rose from the mug in his hands, mingling with his breath in the cool morning air. Spring had finally taken hold, the forest around his remote property bursting with new life. The sound of the screen door opening behind him drew Jake's attention. Sarah stepped out onto the porch, her own coffee mug in hand. "He ate all of it this morning," she reported, "and he's putting weight back on. The wound is healing cleanly." Jake smiled. "He's a fighter." After that night at the Wildlife Center, Jake had made an unprecedented request. He asked to take the elderly bobcat home during its recovery period. Sarah had initially refused, citing regulations and safety concerns. But Jake's argument that euthanasia was the only other option eventually swayed her. With special permits arranged through their connections at the Forest Service and strict protocols for the animal's care, the arrangement was approved. Jake had converted his tool shed into a recovery space for the bobcat, which they had started calling Shadow, after noting the dark markings on its face. Sarah visited regularly to check on its progress and administer medication. To everyone's surprise, the bobcat was responding remarkably well to treatment. "I submitted the paperwork yesterday," Sarah said, leaning against the porch railing. "If approved, you'll be the first licensed rehabilitator in the state permitted to provide permanent sanctuary care for a non-releasable native wildcat on private property. The committee was impressed by your proposal for the enclosure design." Jake nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I've already ordered the materials. Once the permit comes through, I can start construction immediately." "You understand what you're taking on, right?" Sarah asked. "He might live another year, maybe 2 with proper care. That's daily feeding, medication, monitoring. You'll essentially be tethered to this place until he's gone," Jake finished. "I know." "What made you decide to do this?" Sarah asked. "In 20 years, I've never seen you get this attached to a rescue." Jake was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the distant mountains. "When we were on that bridge, after the crash, he could have disappeared forever. Freedom was right there for the taking. Instead, he came back to me. That means something, Sarah. I can't explain it, but it means something." Sarah didn't argue. She had witnessed the unusual bond between Jake and Shadow firsthand during treatment sessions. The bobcat that should have been aggressive and fearful instead displayed a remarkable tolerance for Jake's presence, even seeking proximity when anxious. "Well, the old fellow certainly landed on his feet," Sarah said with a smile. "From starving on a cliff ledge to having his own private wilderness estate with room service." Jake laughed. "Don't let him hear you say that. He still has his dignity." Later that morning, after Sarah had departed, Jake visited Shadow in the converted shed. The bobcat was resting on a specially designed platform that allowed him to survey the room from an elevated position. His golden eyes tracked Jake's movements as he entered. "Morning, old-timer," Jake said softly. "Hear that? I've got permission to build you a proper home here." As if understanding, Shadow blinked slowly before rising to his feet. His movements were still stiff, but the desperate weakness of those first days had given way to a measured grace that hinted at his former power. He approached the front of the enclosure and pressed his forehead against the mesh separating them. Jake extended his fingers through the mesh, gently touching the spot between Shadow's ears that the bobcat had indicated he enjoyed. A deep rumbling emanated from the animal's chest. Not quite a purr, but as close as a bobcat could manage. "You and me, we've got a deal," Jake said. "For as long as you need." Outside, spring sunlight filtered through the pine forest, casting long shadows across the rugged terrain of Montana. Somewhere in this vast wilderness, a younger, stronger bobcat would perhaps claim the territory once ruled by Shadow. Life in the wild continued its eternal cycle of struggle and survival. But here, in this unexpected sanctuary, an aging predator and the man who had twice saved his life had forged something rare and precious, a connection that transcended the natural boundaries between wild and tame, predator and human. Shadow had once ruled these forests with unchallenged dominance. Now, in his final seasons, he would know something perhaps even more valuable than freedom: peace, security, and the quiet companionship of a human who had recognized in those golden eyes a dignity worthy of respect. Jake watched as Shadow returned to his platform and settled comfortably, golden eyes half closed in contentment. The wildlife rehabilitator smiled. Some rescues changed the animal. Some changed the rescuer. The best ones, Jake reflected, changed them both. The morning sun kissed the peaks of the Rockies, casting long golden fingers over the quiet mountain village of Pinecrest. Pinecrest had always been quiet, predictable. Yet, as the wind whispered through the pines, carrying a sound Anna Woodson couldn't quite place. Something between a sigh and a warning. Her granddaughter, Maria Woodson, had become a target. They thought she was vulnerable. They thought she was an easy target. But when 3 men cornered Maria in the woods, they didn't expect the forest itself rising to protect her. A blur of tawny fur. A deep, primal growl that sent a chill through the night. And then, chaos. What they saw in the darkness left them running for their lives, shaken to their core. Because sometimes, the most powerful protectors aren't human at all. This is the story of a secret guardian, a fierce bond, and the day a predator chose to stand between danger and the one he called family. Before we start, hit the like button and make sure to subscribe if you haven't, and hit that notification bell so that you won't miss any new stories.
The morning light filtered through the curtains of Anna Woodson's modest cabin, painting golden streaks across the weathered pine floorboards. At 78, Anna moved slowly but deliberately, her gnarled hands working with practiced precision as she prepared her morning tea. Outside her window, the vast wilderness of northern Montana stretched toward the horizon, dense forests of pine and spruce climbing the foothills before giving way to the majestic Rocky Mountains beyond. Anna had lived in the small community of Pinecrest all her life. The village, little more than a collection of homes and a few businesses nestled along a two-lane highway, had once thrived with the logging industry. Now it survived mostly on tourism and the stubborn resilience of its aging residents. Another day, Anna whispered to herself, her voice carrying a melodic lilt that hinted at the songs she used to sing while working. For over 50 years, she had risen before dawn to milk the cows at the Henderson Dairy Farm on the outskirts of town. Though most of her contemporaries had long since retired to rocking chairs or moved to warmer climates, Anna had continued working well into her 70s, only stopping when her failing eyesight made the pre-dawn walks too dangerous. A tap at her door interrupted her morning ritual. Anna squinted through her thick glasses, making her way carefully across the room. Many of the younger folks in town checked on her regularly, bringing groceries or simply stopping by for conversation. Anna appreciated their concern, though she fiercely guarded her independence. "Good morning, Mrs. Woodson," called Jack Turner, standing on her porch with a crooked smile. In his arms, he held what appeared to be a small bundle wrapped in an old flannel shirt. "Got something special for you today." Anna regarded him with guarded suspicion. Jack was known throughout Pinecrest as a skilled hunter, but also as a man whose ethics bent with the direction of profit. His father had been the same way, always looking for an angle, always willing to skirt regulations when game wardens weren't looking. "What brings you by so early, Jack?" she asked, keeping one hand on the doorframe. "Found this little one out by Blackwater Ridge yesterday," he said, adjusting the bundle in his arms. "Rare breed of mountain cat, a special kind that folks pay good money for as pets. Thought of you right away." The bundle moved, and Anna caught sight of tufted ears and a tiny face with striking amber eyes. "A kitten?" she asked, her resolve softening. Since her husband William had passed 7 years ago, the cabin had felt too quiet. Her daughter lived 3 states away in Chicago, and though her granddaughter Maria had moved back to Pinecrest last year to teach at the local elementary school, the days could be long and silent. Not just any kitten, Jack insisted. This here's a special breed. Valuable, but needs a good home with someone who has time to care for it proper. He paused, shifting his weight. I'd normally ask a high price, but for you, Mrs. Woodson, seeing as how you've always been kind to me, I'll let it go for just $300. Anna hesitated. $300 was nearly half of her monthly Social Security check. Even with her small pension from the dairy, money was always tight. I don't know, Jack. Look at those eyes, Jack urged, unwrapping the bundle further. Ever seen a house cat with eyes like that? This is special stock. My cousin in Idaho breeds them for celebrities, worth thousands to the right buyer. The kitten mewed softly, and something in Anna's heart shifted. The creature looked up at her with intelligent eyes, curious but unafraid. I'll give you $200, she said finally. That's all I can spare this month. Jack's smile widened. For you, Mrs. Woodson, that'll do just fine. 20 minutes later, Anna sat in her rocking chair, the kitten exploring her lap with delicate paws. She had given Jack all the cash she had in the house, which meant she would need to be careful with groceries until next month's check arrived. Still, looking at the beautiful creature, she couldn't bring herself to regret the decision. What shall I call you? She mused, stroking the kitten's spotted fur. It was larger than most kittens she'd seen, with unusually large paws and distinctive tufts at the tops of its ears. Its coat was a tawny color with subtle spots, and those remarkable amber eyes seemed to hold a wisdom beyond its years. The kitten responded with a sound somewhere between a purr and a chirp. You're a talkative one, Anna laughed. How about Mick? My husband William used to call our old tomcat Mick because he said he was always making mischief. The kitten chirped again and butted its head against her hand, as if approving the choice. Over the next few weeks, Anna and Mick settled into a comfortable routine. The kitten grew rapidly, developing a healthy appetite that Anna struggled to satisfy. Unlike other cats she'd owned over the years, Mick seemed particularly fond of the raw meat scraps she brought home from the butcher's shop. He turned his nose up at commercial cat food, only reluctantly eating it when nothing else was available. You're a picky one, Anna told him, watching as he devoured a piece of raw venison her neighbor had brought over. And growing like a weed. What kind of cat did Jack say you were? Mick didn't answer, of course, but his purr rumbled through the cabin like distant thunder. As the weeks passed, Anna's concern grew along with her unusual pet. By the time 3 months had passed, Mick was larger than any house cat she'd ever seen. His paws seemed disproportionately large, and his behaviors were increasingly distinctive. He could jump to the top of her refrigerator in a single bound. He paced the cabin restlessly at night, and occasionally made vocalizations that sounded nothing like a normal cat's meow. Grandma, are you home? Maria's voice called from the porch one Saturday morning in early autumn. Come in, dear, Anna responded, setting aside her mending. Maria Woodson stepped into the cabin, bringing with her the scent of crisp mountain air and the youthful energy that always seemed to brighten the room. At 27, she had her grandfather's height and her mother's dark eyes and hair. After college in Boston and 3 years teaching in Denver, she had returned to Pinecrest, saying she missed the mountains and the tight-knit community. I brought you some. Maria stopped mid-sentence, her eyes widening as they fell on Mick, who was stretched out on the hearth rug. Grandma, she said slowly, what is that? That's Mick, my new cat, Anna replied proudly. Jack Turner sold him to me a few months back. Said he was a special breed. Maria approached cautiously, studying the animal with increasing alarm. Grandma, that's not a house cat. I think. I'm pretty sure that's a lynx. A what? A lynx. A wild cat, a predator. They're native to these mountains, but rare. They're protected by federal law. Maria pulled out her phone and quickly searched for images. Look, see the ear tufts? The short tail? The oversized paws? That's a Canada lynx. Anna adjusted her glasses, looking from the phone to her pet and back again. The resemblance was undeniable. "Oh my," she whispered, suddenly understanding why Mick had seemed so different from other cats she'd known. "Jack Turner told me it was a special breed of house cat." "He lied to you," Maria said, her voice tightening with anger. "He probably poached the mother and sold you the cub. This is completely illegal, Grandma. We need to call the wildlife authorities." Anna looked at Mick, who had awakened and was watching them with those intelligent amber eyes. He stretched languidly before padding over to rub against her legs, his rumbling purr filling the space between them. "No," Anna said quietly but firmly. "What do you mean, no? Grandma, you can't keep a wild lynx as a pet." "He's not wild, not anymore," Anna insisted, reaching down to stroke Mick's head. "He's been with me since he was a tiny thing. He's gentle and well-behaved. He's never shown any aggression." "That's not the point," Maria argued. "It's illegal, and it's not fair to him. Wild animals belong in the wild. Where would they take him?" Anna asked. Maria sighed. "Probably to a wildlife rehabilitation center, and eventually they'd try to release him back into the forest. But Grandma, he's already half-grown. If he stays here much longer, he might never be able to survive in the wild." Anna's hand trembled slightly as she continued to pet Mick. "He's all I have here all day," she said softly. "Since your grandfather passed." Her voice trailed off. Maria's expression softened. She knelt beside her grandmother and took her weathered hand. "I understand, I do. But this isn't like keeping a stray cat. This is a protected species." Mick chose that moment to stand up on his hind legs, placing his front paws on Anna's knees and looking directly into her face. He made a soft chirping sound, then bumped his head gently against her chin. Anna's eyes welled with tears. "Look at him, Maria. He trusts me. He loves me." Maria watched the interaction with a mixture of amazement and concern. The bond between her grandmother and the young lynx was undeniable. What Jack Turner had done was unethical and illegal, but the situation now was complicated by the fact that the lynx had clearly imprinted on Anna. "Let me look into this," Maria finally said. "Maybe there's a middle ground, some way to legally register him as a rescue or something. But Grandma, please keep this quiet. If the wrong people find out, there could be serious consequences." Over the next few weeks, Maria researched wildlife regulations while Anna continued to care for Mick. The young lynx grew stronger and more impressive by the day. By 6 months, he weighed nearly 30 pounds and could leap from the floor to the top of Anna's bookshelves without effort. Despite his increasing size and strength, Mick remained gentle with Anna, seeming to understand her frailty. He slept at the foot of her bed each night and followed her around the cabin during the day like a devoted shadow. Maria eventually discovered that while keeping a native lynx was indeed prohibited, the situation was complicated by the fact that Mick had been hand-raised and might not survive if released into the wild. After consulting discreetly with a wildlife biologist at the university in Missoula, she learned that in rare cases, special permits could be granted for educational purposes. "The key is to prove he's better off as an ambassador animal than trying to survive in the wild," she explained to Anna. "But it would mean registering him, getting proper veterinary care, and possibly allowing him to be part of educational programs." "Whatever it takes," Anna said firmly. "I won't lose him." As autumn deepened into winter, Mick continued to thrive under Anna's care. With Maria's help, they built a secure outdoor enclosure attached to the cabin, giving Mick space to exercise while keeping him safe from curious neighbors. To Anna's surprise, the lynx seemed to recognize the boundaries of his new territory, never attempting to escape even when the door was left open. What neither of them expected was Mick's apparent desire to accompany them on walks in the forest behind the cabin. The first time it happened, Maria was terrified that Mick would bolt into the wilderness, never to return. Instead, he stayed within sight, occasionally disappearing into the underbrush only to reappear minutes later, seemingly checking that his humans were still there. "It's like he's keeping an eye on us," Maria marveled, watching as Mick effortlessly climbed a pine tree, then descended headfirst. "Like he thinks we're the ones who need protecting." Anna smiled, leaning on her walking stick. "He knows we're family." By spring, Mick had become a treasured, if secret, member of their household. Only a handful of trusted friends knew about his existence, and all had been sworn to secrecy while Maria continued to work on obtaining the proper permits. It was also in spring that trouble arrived in Pinecrest. The first signs were subtle: loud music late at night from the old Tanner property at the edge of town, beer cans littering the roadside, complaints from the diner about customers who were rude to the waitstaff. Gradually, the community learned that Kyle Tanner, who had inherited his grandfather's property, had moved in with 3 friends from the city. All 4 were in their mid-20s, unemployed, and seemed to have little respect for the quiet rhythms of village life. "They're just young men letting off steam," Anna said when Maria complained about their behavior. "They'll settle down." But as weeks passed, the disruptions grew more concerning. Reports circulated of trespassing, suspicious fires in the forest, and harassing comments directed at women walking alone. The sheriff's department, short-staffed and responsible for a large rural area, could do little beyond occasional warnings. One Thursday afternoon in late May, Maria was walking home from school, taking the shortcut through the community park, when she noticed Kyle Tanner and 2 of his friends lounging on picnic tables near the path. She tightened her grip on her bag and kept her eyes forward, hoping to pass without incident. "Well, look who it is," Kyle called out, his voice carrying the slight slur of afternoon drinking. "The pretty teacher." Maria quickened her pace, but Kyle jumped down from the table and stepped into her path. "What's your hurry? We're just being friendly." He grinned, revealing a chipped front tooth. "Why don't you join us for a drink?" "No, thank you," Maria said firmly. "I need to get home." One of Kyle's friends circled around, blocking her path from behind. "Come on, darling. Don't be stuck up. Please move," Maria said, struggling to keep her voice steady. "I'm not interested." Kyle took a step closer. "You think you're too good for us, is that it? You and all the other locals, looking down your noses at us." Maria's heart raced as she glanced around. The park was otherwise empty, the nearest houses just far enough away that a call for help might go unheard. She considered her options, remembering the self-defense class she'd taken in college, calculating whether she could outrun them if needed. What happened next occurred so quickly that later Maria would struggle to recall the exact sequence of events. A blur of tawny fur erupted from the bushes at the edge of the park. A sound, not quite a roar, not quite a scream, rent the air, shocking in its primal intensity. Mick landed between Maria and Kyle, his back arched, for standing on end, making him appear twice his normal size. His lips pulled back to reveal gleaming teeth, and a growl rumbled from deep in his chest. "What the?" Kyle stumbled backward, eyes wide with shock. "Is that a fucking mountain lion?" The young lynx advanced, his muscles coiled with lethal purpose. Kyle's friend behind Maria let out a strangled yelp and bolted, tripping over his own feet in his haste to escape. "Get away from it," shouted the third man, who had remained by the picnic tables. "Those things can kill you." Kyle, frozen in terror, finally broke from his stupor and scrambled away, putting maximum distance between himself and the creature that seemed to have materialized from his worst nightmares. Maria stood still, her breath caught in her throat, as Mick positioned himself protectively in front of her, amber eyes tracking the retreating men until they disappeared from view. Only then did he turn to her, the fierce predator instantly transforming into the affectionate companion she knew. He chirped softly, rubbing against her legs. "Mick," she whispered, kneeling to embrace him, her hands trembling with relief and residual fear. "How did you even get here? How did you know?" The lynx offered no explanation, of course, but the steady rhythm of his purr gradually calmed Maria's racing heart. Somehow, against all logic, he had followed her, Or perhaps he had been following her all along, a silent guardian moving through the forest parallel to her path. Together, they walked quickly back to Anna's cabin, Maria constantly scanning their surroundings, half expecting Kyle and his friends to reappear. But the forest path remained quiet save for the normal sounds of birdsong and wind through the pines. Anna was sitting on the porch when they arrived, her face lighting up at the sight of them. "There you are?" I was starting to worry. Mick disappeared right after lunch, and I couldn't find him anywhere. Maria climbed the steps and sank into the chair beside her grandmother, recounting what had happened in the park. As she spoke, Anna's expression shifted from concern to outrage to fierce pride. "He protected you," the older woman said when Maria had finished. "Just like family should. But Grandma, this complicates everything. People saw him now. Kyle and his friends will tell others." Anna's chin lifted with determination. "Let them. What they did, threatening you like that, is far worse than us having an unusual pet. Besides, maybe now they'll think twice about bothering anyone in this town." News of the incident spread through Pinecrest with the speed that only small-town gossip can achieve. By the following day, Anna's phone was ringing continuously as neighbors and friends called to check on Maria and ask about the mountain lion that had defended her. Kyle and his friends, meanwhile, were notably subdued. The sheriff paid them a visit after Maria filed a report about the harassment, and rumors circulated that they were now planning to move on, claiming the town was weird and hostile. A week after the incident, Anna received an unexpected visitor. Sheriff Dan Hadley, whom she had known since he was a boy playing in these same forests, stood on her porch, hat in hand. "Mrs. Woodson," he began awkwardly, "I need to ask you about a lynx." Anna invited him in, seeing no point in denials. Mick, as if sensing the importance of the moment, sat regally on the hearth rug, regarding the lawman with unblinking amber eyes. "Well," Sheriff Hadley said after a long moment, "I've been hearing some wild stories, but I admit I didn't fully believe them until now." "He's been with me since he was a kitten," Anna explained. "I didn't know what he was at first. By the time Maria identified him, we'd already bonded." The sheriff nodded slowly. "I figured it was something like that. Jack Turner's involved, I'm guessing." Anna looked down. "I don't want to cause trouble." "You're not the one causing trouble, Mrs. Woodson. Poaching protected wildlife is a serious offense." He glanced at Mick. "Though I have to say, I've never seen a lynx behave like this. It's almost like he understands every word we're saying." "He's special," Anna said simply. Sheriff Hadley ran a hand through his thinning hair. "I should report this to Fish and Wildlife. By the book, that's what needs to happen." "And will you?" Maria asked from the doorway, having arrived home during their conversation. The sheriff was quiet for a long moment. "Kyle Tanner and his buddies have been a thorn in my side for months. I've been waiting for them to step over a line I could actually enforce." He looked at Maria. "What they did to you in the park, that was that line. But before I could do anything meaningful, your four-legged friend here apparently scared them straight. Word is they're packing up, heading back to wherever they came from." He turned back to Mick, who had not moved from his dignified pose on the hearth. "I think," the sheriff said carefully, "that any official investigation into unusual wildlife sightings will have to wait until I've dealt with more pressing matters. That could take some time." He stood, placing his hat back on his head. "In the meantime, Mrs. Woodson, I'd appreciate it if you and Maria would work on getting whatever permits might be needed for an educational ambassador animal. I hear the outreach programs at the Nature Center are quite successful." Anna's eyes filled with grateful tears. "We're already working on it." "Good." Sheriff Hadley nodded. "And ma'am, thank you, both of you, for being such valued members of this community." After he left, Anna sat beside Mick, stroking his sleek fur. "You hear that? You're a valued member of this community too." In the months that followed, Mick's legend grew throughout Pinecrest. With the sheriff's tacit blessing and the community's protective embrace, Anna and Maria were able to secure the special permits needed to legally keep Mick as an educational ambassador. He made occasional supervised appearances at the school, where children learned about conservation and respect for wildlife. Kyle Tanner and his friends did indeed leave town, their departure celebrated with a noticeable uplift in community spirit. The story of the elderly woman with failing eyesight and her unlikely protector became a cherished local tale, embellished with each retelling until Mick was credited with all manner of heroic deeds. For Anna, now approaching her 80th birthday, the comfort of Mick's presence far outweighed any challenges his unusual nature presented. On quiet evenings, as they sat together on the porch watching the sun set behind the mountains, she often reflected on the strange path that had brought this magnificent creature into her life. Sometimes, she told Maria as they watched Mick patrol the perimeter of the yard one golden autumn afternoon, the things that seem like mistakes turn out to be the greatest blessings. Maria smiled, thinking of the scared young lynx cub who had grown into their fierce protector. And sometimes, she added, the ones we think need saving end up saving us instead. Mick, hearing their voices, paused in his patrol to look back at them, his amber eyes reflecting the setting sun. Then, with the fluid grace that never failed to take their breath away, he bounded back to join his family on the porch, the unexpected guardian of 2 generations of Woodson women, and living proof that the most powerful bonds can form in the most unlikely circumstances. In the forests surrounding Pinecrest, legends now whispered of a watchful presence that kept the village safe. Children playing too far from home would sometimes report glimpsing tawny fur and bright eyes before finding their way back to familiar paths. Hikers lost in sudden mountain storms told of haunting cries that seemed to guide them toward shelter. And in a modest cabin at the forest's edge, an elderly woman with a lifetime of hard work behind her found unexpected joy and purpose in her golden years, thanks to the wild heart that had chosen to make its home alongside her own.